Hello and welcome to this workshop on KeyShot's geometry nodes. In this particular workshop, I will be focusing on the flakes and the bubbles geometry node options that are within KeyShot and how you can add these in and manipulate the settings to create different effects within your models. For this particular demonstration, I will be applying both of these types of nodes to a sensory tube. And what I'm displaying currently on the screen is what the end result will look like. So within this sensory tube, there will be bubbles of varying sizes with a density change from it being heavily populated near the bottom compared to it being a bit sparse at the top. And I'll be doing the same for the flakes option, getting similar settings with the density spread. And I'll also show you how you can then manipulate each of those individual flakes to display an image or an icon. Okay. So first of all, I'm just going to toggle between my model sets. So I can start off with a fresh sensory tube that doesn't have those bubbles or flakes applied into it. So first one I'm going to show you is the bubbles option. So here I'm just going to double click on this particular part of the sensory tube, which is this main transparent tube that you can see in the center there. Now when it comes to the bubbles geometry node, it does need to be applied to a transparent material, whether that be a plastic, liquid or glass, just because it will always be inside the geometry itself. So obviously if you had a solid material type, you wouldn't see these bubbles. So to apply bubbles, you need to open up the material graph first of all. And then here we can see already kind of what materials has been applied to that part itself. Now if I right click the material graph window, under the geometry flyout is where I'll find bubbles. So I can bring that node into the window and I can attach that to the geometry of the part itself. If I double click on the bubbles node, it will show me all the parameter values I've got within there. And to begin with, I'm just going to hit execute geometry node so we can see what these values do to the model itself. So we can see we've got quite a heavily populated sensory tube here with lots of tiny little bubbles. So to begin with, I'm just going to reduce that density down so we can see kind of more options within there. So there we go. So now we haven't got as many bubbles populating that space. And at the moment, again, they're all still the same size. So to manipulate that, I can then start to change what I want the sizing to be. If I want them bigger or smaller. And I can also change the variation. So maybe I don't want them all to be linear in sizing. I do want them to kind of fluctuate between large and small bubbles. So again, I can click that execute geometry. And here we can see some of those bubbles did increase in size and others may have reduced. Okay, it kind of gives it a bit more of a realistic look within there. Can I see at the moment that the kind of spread of bubbles is quite even from the top to the bottom. So if I wanted to manipulate the kind of density of bubbles throughout, what I can do here is I can apply a color gradient texture. So I apply this to the density of the bubbles node, and I can then double click on the color gradient node to then manipulate its settings. Now to see exactly where this color gradient is, if I click on the letter C on my keyboard, it brings up what's known as a color preview, and it kind of helps you be able to manipulate what is currently in there so you can see which way that gradient is going. So for this example, I'm going to have it the black part of the gradient at the top and the white at the bottom. And what this should do, if I disable the color preview and hit that geometry nodes option, is kind of effectively force all the bubbles to the bottom of the sensory tube and then reducing the density as it goes up. So that's kind of what you can do with the bubbles option. The next geometry node I'm going to show you is the flakes. So going back onto my scene tree, I have this hidden tube within here. So I'm just going to unhide it to see it and double click to manipulate the materials. So at the moment, this is just a solid white plastic, as we can see in the real-time window as well. And I'm going to open the material graph up to then apply those flakes. The reason why I've got to do it on a separate part is you can't have more than one geometry node per model. Okay, so if you did want to have a model similar to this one, where it's going to be utilizing both the bubbles and the flakes geometry node, it is best to duplicate that part. Okay, so if I right click in that window and under the geometry flyout, I can then find the flakes. I can then connect this up to the geometry of that part. So if I double click on the flakes node, I can see that the numerical parameters of this node are very similar to the bubbles options. So they're going to do exactly the same kind of concept within there. There's just a couple of extra tick boxes and radio buttons that you can change. So looking at this first option of flake shape, I could say I want them all to be spherical. And when I execute that geometry node, it then looks like I've got solid balls throughout that part. The other option is to have them as square. Again, if I execute those geometry nodes out, they now look like there's going to be flakes, like kind of glitter flakes throughout that tube. As I said, the numerical values are very similar to what we have in the bubbles option. So I'm just going to slightly manipulate some of these. And then when I execute the geometry nodes, you can see within there how that has changed it. So some of these flakes have then got a lot bigger, but they're also varying in size. And there's also kind of less flakes in there than was to begin with because I've just reduced that density value down. Again, to show you that it does work the same as the bubbles node, I'm just going to apply that color gradient texture again to the density of these flakes. Double clicking on the color gradient and hitting C on my keyboard to apply that color preview. I can then manipulate where I want that gradient to sit. So again, I'm just replicating exactly what I did for the bubbles option and executing the geometry nodes, so we can see that the density of the flakes is more populated at the bottom of the tube compared to at the top. Now, another thing that flakes can do, as mentioned at the beginning of this workshop, is it can take on the image of any kind of icons or textures that you apply onto each of the individual flakes. So to do this, you need to apply a texture to the main material that is applied to that part. So if I double click on the plastic nose and go to its textures, for the diffuse option, I can then say I want to bring in a texture map. Okay, so this will open up my file system where I can find the image that I want to use, and it will automatically apply it on. The default setting is that it maps this as a box type. What we want for this particular option is the UV. So it's picking up the UV coordinates of those flakes to apply that texture map. Now, as well as it being on the diffuse, so we want it to drive the colouring of the material, we also want it on the opacity because this is a PNG file and we don't want the background around the fish. To further emphasize that, we need to change the opacity map mode to alpha so that it does put the transparency where we want it around the outline of the fish. So you can see at the moment you can't really see any difference. The flakes have kind of disappeared. That's because there's one final setting you need to do before you can execute, and that's to go back to that flakes node, tick the flake UV option, and then click on the execute geometry nodes. And that has now applied that fish image to each of those flakes within that tube. So I'm just going to close down the material graph. And there you go. That is how you can apply your bubbles and flakes into your images. And I'll just zoom on in there and let this sit for a bit so you can see what that final outcome is. Thank you for listening.